Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another installment of Trek Talk, where I'll examine an episode of the original Star Trek series. This week, I'm taking a look at The Enemy Within. In production code order, this would be the fourth episode that was produced, although it was what I think sixth aired, maybe something like that. Hello, DJ Ronnie G. Thanks for stopping by, sir. Yeah, real Trek. We love to see it, right? Okay, so and while I review this episode, I will be reading from These Are the Voyages by Mark Cushman, as usual, to get some behind the scenes information. And I'll just go ahead and start with that. So this is from an NBC press release from September 13th of 1966. A malfunction in the transporter room of the USS Enterprise turns Captain Kirk into a Jekyll and Hyde in The Enemy Within on Star Trek NBC Television Network Colorcast of Thursday, October 6th. While being beamed aboard his spacecraft from another planet in what is normally a routine operation, the commander is the victim of an electrical failure that literally transforms him into two Captain Kirks. The Enterprise is threatened with complete chaos when the two personalities, identical in appearance but opposite in behavior and intellect, vie in a nightmarish conflict for control of the ship. And then Cushman himself writes, Lieutenant Sulu and a landing party, meanwhile, are stranded on a barren world where the nighttime temperatures drop so low as to make survival impossible. With the transporter out, the officers of the Enterprise are unable to depend on their captain and are running out of time to find a way to save the men left behind. The theme of this episode, being a leader, requires a melding of one's bad as well as the good. Every ingredient for a good, if not great, hour of dramatic TV is here. Conflict, a difficult life and death decision, self revelation, a bold statement, and a ticking clock. A better opponent cannot be found for Kirk than Kirk himself. Spock says it best, quote, "It is apparent that, however different in temperament, this double has your knowledge of the ship, its crew, its devices." Unquote. Kirk is literally fighting himself, and therefore the protagonist and the antagonist are one and the same. The Enemy Within is an important episode in the evolution of Star Trek. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And it serves to further define the series' two leads. We see the guts of Kirk on display, both as good and bad. The evil Kirk lives within the captain of the Enterprise and is the monster of the story. As for Spock, he is given a chance to explain his mixed heritage and confess to the difficult challenges presented by his hybrid makeup. Enemy also introduces the Kirk Spock McCoy triangle, with Spock and McCoy playing a game of tug and war and the captain serving as the rope. This episode helped to solidify the differences and establish the feud between Spock and McCoy. The first instance may be the most telling when Spock says, quote, "For once, I agree with you, Doctor." And it was this script that inadvertently resulted in the creation of the Spock neck pinch, as the writers and cast soon named it, although the fans would call it the Vulcan nerve pinch. With these attributes, The Enemy Within is nonetheless flawed. There are a few production goofs that can be spotted without even trying, and one must wonder why they didn't use a shuttlecraft to rescue the crewmen stranded on the planet. And Cushman does write about that, and I'll explain that later. Finally, it is here that we are treated to the first example of Star Trek, of William Shatner going a bit over the top. A bit? A bit over the top? This is not only a tale of two Kirks, but a tale of two Shatners. An argument can be made for the exuberant performance regarding the evil Kirk. An argument can also be made that director Leo Penn should have said, "Bring it down a notch, Bill." For the attempted rape scene, however, Shatner is right on his mark, and so is Penn. The violent encounter is frighteningly real and extremely daring, especially for its time. It still raises an eyebrow today. In 1966, it was quite shocking. A script penned by Richard Matheson gave Roddenberry bragging rights among the science fiction community. Matheson had frequently written for The Twilight Zone, including Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which of course starred Shatner. On the big screen, Matheson wrote The Incredible Shrinking Man, based on his own book, and The Last Man on Earth, a screen adaptation of his sci fi horror novel, I Am Legend. And of course, that got remade later with Will Smith. Like 15 years ago, 20 years ago? He also adapted Jules Verne to the big screen in the space opera Master of the World. Is that a space opera, really? I don't really see that as a space opera, but as well as the short stories and poems of Edgar Allan Poe for filmmaker Roger Corman, including House of Usher, Tales of Terror, and The Pit and the Pendulum, and The Raven. By 1964, Matheson was scripting tongue-in-cheek horror films for American International, such as The Comedy of Terror, again starring Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, and Boris Karloff, and 1965's Die, 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 My Darling. Right before this Star Trek assignment, he had scripted Time of Flight for the Bob Hope Chrysler Theater. In years to come, Matheson would write the screenplays for The Night Stalker. So the Carl Kolchak, I guess he probably wrote the pilot movie, as well as Somewhere in Time, which is, I believe, that Christopher Reeve time travel movie, and Steven Spielberg's cult TV hit Duel. As for the inspiration behind this story, Matheson said, quote, I had just looked at Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and immediately saw the potential of using the transporter device for separating the two sides of a person's character. And it was part of my original concept that Kirk needed that negative element in his personality in order to be a good captain. I think probably we're all mixtures of good and bad. If any one of us was all good, we'd be boring, and leaders have to have that drive and that ambition. Matheson's first draft hit Roddenberry's desk on April 25th of that year. New to the story now, at Roddenberry's insistence, was the subplot dealing with the men left behind on the planet. But originally, the leader of those men was not Sulu, but another crewman named North. Quote, I was a little disappointed that Roddenberry built in a necessity to have a B story about the members of his crew stuck on the planet, Matheson admitted. I can see why he did it, because B stories seemed to be a very regular occurrence in television in those days, and maybe still are. But I wanted to concentrate on Bill Shatner's performance because he was so good. I had more for him to do in that way. I used to go out of my way to watch Bill Shatner on TV. He was in 2 of the Twilight Zone episodes I wrote, and he was wonderful in both of them, a very dynamic actor. I didn't write the script the way I did to challenge him. I wrote it to make it as good as I could, but I was still confident that Bill could do it. Matheson reluctantly added in the B story, taking care not to let it dominate the tale, one he believed had enough drama in it already. With all of Kirk's inner angst, creating an outside problem for him to deal with felt artificial to Matheson. Roddenberry disagreed, believing that the men stranded on the planet not only put pressure on Kirk and created an urgency for him to resolve his problem, but tested the captain, better illustrating the point Matheson wanted to make about the human qualities required to make a command decision. And I agree with Roddenberry in this instance. I think having the problem of the crewmen down on the planet, I think that was actually a good thing to add in, and it made for a more compelling story because, like you said, it really puts a timer on things where Kirk's got to make a decision and make it quick. Um, but I don't know. I mean, I happen to think it's a good idea. Uh, Roddenberry also suggested that Kirk not allowing himself the prerogative of letting the crew in on his dilemma. He knew from his own experience in the military that in order to lead, a leader can never be seen as weak in the eyes of his subordinates. This would be one more weight on the strained shoulders of the tormented captain. These suggestions and more infuse the story and character elements with the concepts and themes that elevate the enemy within to classic status. It was no longer just an outer space version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Matheson later said Roddenberry had a specific attitude toward the writing of the show. It had to be maintained or he wasn't satisfied. Rod Serling, on the other hand, was very open minded. I mean, he was a writer himself. I guess Roddenberry was a writer too. Ouch. Yeah, I guess he was sort of a writer. But Rod did not have any compulsion to impose his own way of thinking on the other writers. He did his scripts for The Twilight Zone as social commentary, which Chuck Beaumont and I never did, and he never said anything about that. He let ours be different. Beyond the issues of screen credit and residuals, the magnitude of the work being done by the freelance writers on Star Trek was out of proportion to the money paid. The volume of the workload expected of Star Trek was unprecedented, with writers often receiving dozens of pages of notes from the producer on each and every draft, requiring more than mere script polishing, but complete overhauling of their teleplays. What would be 2 weeks of work on most other shows would become almost, for the same money, a full month's work on Star Trek. This obsessive rewriting helped to make a TV classic, but left in its wake many bruised egos, aborted writing assignments, and irreparably damaged producer writer relationships. Leonard Nimoy was enthusiastic about the script. Nonetheless, he had some issues, and it was here where Nimoy began giving script notes, something seldom allowed for in television production at the time. His letter to Roddenberry began, Gene, I hope you won't mind my dropping some notes on the enemy within. Generally, I feel it is the best material we have had so far, and I will not dwell on the things I like, but rather on some of the areas which struck me as problematic. Among them, Nimoy was bothered by the antagonistic relationship between Spock and McCoy. He complained that it bordered on open hostility. He continued, also, it comes at a time when the captain is in trouble, and the bickering in scenes 18 and 19 reduces two military men to a pair of children arguing over who should do the errand for mommy. Time would prove Nimoy wrong on this point. The fans of Star Trek came to love the Spock McCoy feuding. For this story in particular, the bickering helps to visualize much of Kirk's growing inner conflict. However, the character conflict in the draft of the script needed and would receive some refinement. Roddenberry would make additional script changes, with revised pages coming in on June 11th and even after production began on June 15th. It was Roddenberry who added the tidy conclusion to the confrontation on the bridge, with evil Kirk falling apart and seeking the embrace of the good Kirk. In Matheson's script, Kirk had knocked his evil self out with a phaser. Despite the screen credit acknowledging only Matheson as the writer, the script was now a collaborative endeavor. Quote, I know he wasn't happy with the rewrite Gene Roddenberry did on The Enemy Within, and he shouldn't have been, said John D. Black. Matheson was a fine writer. I mean, he was very good. He knew screenwriting, he knew teleplay writing, he knew how to do it, and you could tell. Now, when you had somebody in there who didn't know their ass from a hole in the ground, okay, you got busy behind the typewriter. But if somebody did know how to write, you knew that right away. Mary Black said, you don't rewrite a good writer. You don't go fiddle with it, particularly when you've had a couple of belts. You don't do that. You just don't. That's all. Especially Matheson. He was a superb writer. I had more respect for him than almost anybody. And with the writing and the rewriting of this episode, the growing dissension in the producers' offices had begun. Okay, so let's get into the episode itself. So, this episode opens with the Enterprise in orbit of Alpha 177, where some of the crew are gathering specimens of fauna and flora, I guess, including this doggy in some kind of alien outfit. Crewman, or excuse me, geological technician Fisher takes a spill, injuring his hand. Kirk tells him to go to sick bay. He beams up, and the transporter behaves strangely, with a warning light going off, but he comes through okay. He's covered with some kind of dust, which Scotty says has some sort of electromagnetic properties, and tells Fisher to go decontaminate his uniform. Then Kirk beams up, and initially he's a bit dizzy from the beam up, and Scotty takes him to his quarters. But after they leave and the transporter room is empty, of course, the transporter goes off again, and a duplicate Kirk appears. This one complete with his own uniform, and even his lighting is evil. Oh, and I forgot to mention, yeah. So, and they mentioned production goofs in the script, and yeah, and in this scene, a pretty blatant goof. You note on Kirk's uniform, no badge, no Starfleet Delta on his uniform. It's missing. And it's the same thing with the duplicate. His uniform also has no badge. So the double goes to sick bay, where he confronts, well, first, the Delta got lost because it's made out of a special alloy. Okay. And I made that up. Well, it's such an obvious thing. You would think they would have caught that. I mean, how did they not notice? Um, I don't know. It's obviously a goof that it's hard to excuse. It reminds me of that shot on Game of Thrones where the coffee cup, like the Starbucks cup, is on the table, and it's like, how did no one see that? Oh well. But actually, before the duplicate gets to sick bay, so the positive Kirk, I guess, goes back to his quarters. Yeoman Rand is waiting there with some reports, but he dismisses her quickly. And then he lays out on his bed and tries to rest. The doppelganger then goes to sickbay and demands brandy. And McCoy hands over the brandy, which I don't know. Is it me, or is it really the most professional thing to have bottles of liquor in your sick bay? I mean, you know, and there's two of them, because if you look in the background, there's obviously two of these bottles. So he's got like a couple of bottles of liquor in his office. I'm sure it's for medicinal purposes only. So then the doppelganger begins roaming the halls, getting drunk, and then he finds Yeoman Rand's quarters. Yeah. Yeah, strictly for medicinal purposes. Then Spock comes to Kirk's quarters and tells him that McCoy said Kirk was acting like a wild man and came to sickbay demanding brandy. Kirk suggests that McCoy is playing games with Spock, leaving Spock evidently somewhat irritated, but he leaves. But then they both get called to to the transporter room, where Scotty tells them that the transporter is not functioning properly. He then tells them that the transporter duplicated this alien dog when they beamed it up. Shortly afterwards, a second one appeared. And so now we have two of them. This one here, which is docile and harmless, and another which is vicious and ferocious. Scotty noting that we don't dare beam up the landing party now until we can get this problem solved. Rand then comes to her quarters, and finds Kirk, the other evil Kirk, there waiting for her. And the double tells her, "You're too beautiful to ignore. Too much woman. We've both been pretending too long, Yeoman. Let's stop pretending." And then he gets, a bit grapey and tries to force himself upon Rand. They fall to the floor in a scuffle, and she scratches his face and is able to get away from him. She gets to the door, which opens, and crewman Fisher sees them. Then Rand tells him to call Spock. He tries to contact the bridge, but the double subdues him and then flees. Shortly afterwards, Spock again goes to Kirk's quarters to question him. And this is where I believe we get the first appearance of the green tunic on Star Trek. He's wearing, and obviously they put him in this so they can help differentiate between, the evil Kirk and the good Kirk and all that. But he says that McCoy said that Kirk came to sickbay and demanded this bottle of brandy and then left. And then Rand says that Kirk came to her quarters and assaulted her, and this bottle of brandy was there. Kirk denies getting the brandy from sickbay or attacking Rand, and then they go to sickbay to get answers. In sickbay, Rand tells them about Kirk attacking her. She mentions that she scratched Kirk's face. And Kirk points out that he has no scratches and insists that it wasn't him. But Fisher is there in sickbay as well and says that it was him. Spock then concludes that they have an imposter aboard. Now, on the planet, the temperature, which gets below 140 degrees at night, is dropping, and the landing party is in danger of freezing. And they can't beam anyone else up until they figure out what's wrong with the transporter. Now, Scotty speculates that the yellow dust that Fisher was covered in has got something to do with the transporter malfunctions. And I think it's an interesting touch here, as they kind of show. I mean, they do tell you eventually, but initially they kind of show you, as Kirk is sort of, cradling the creature and kind of, you know, carrying it almost like an infant, kind of demonstrating that this is a sort of kinder, gentler Kirk, for lack of a better term. The positive Kirk suggests search parties to look for the double, because at this point, of course, they figured out, oh, okay, the transporter duplicated Kirk, and now there's this other Kirk running around. But Spock warns that they shouldn't or they shouldn't kill the other Kirk because they don't know what effect that is going to have on the good Kirk. And in this scene, we see the good Kirk is already starting to become somewhat indecisive. The positive Kirk plans to announce that there is an intruder on board, but Spock warns him that they must keep the truth from the crew, as the Captain Kirk can't allow himself to be seen as fallible in their eyes. And I don't know. I have a bit of a issue with this. I mean, on the surface, yes, it does make sense, but I don't know. How long would they be able to maintain that? It seems like this would have to come out eventually, and I would think Spock would see the logic of that, you know? It's not that I disagree with it, it's that I kind of disagree with Spock being the one to make the argument. I think that would be my point more. Okay, so the good Kirk makes the announcement, and Spock also has to remind him that the phasers are to be set on stun. The evil Kirk, who is in Kirk's quarters now, is enraged when he hears the other Kirk over the intercom. And this is where we get probably treated to our first incident of William Shatner really going for it. as he screams, "I'm Captain Kirk!" And it's also the first time we see, like, in this episode where the evil Kirk's head is just like really sweaty. He's like got the sweat, and I think what this is really supposed to sort of symbolize is that the evil Kirk, he it seems like he's perpetually in fight or flight mode, basically. His sympathetic nervous system is constantly being stimulated, and there's probably, his adrenal cortex is basically just dropping adrenaline into his system, and that's probably sending his blood pressure through the roof, and his uh, heartbeat is probably elevated, respiration's elevated too. It seems like it's kind of a reversal. I mean, they never really explain it, but I would suspect that the good Kirk, it's kind of the opposite. His blood pressure is probably kind of dropping and maybe getting almost dangerously low, because it seems like he's just kind of lethargic and doesn't have a lot of energy. All right, now realizing that these scratches can help identify him, he finds some makeup in Kirk's quarters, or in his quarters, because he is Kirk too, after all. Why does Kirk have makeup in his quarters? Hey, it's the future. Who knows? Anyway, he uses that to cover up the scratches. Then as he's leaving, he calls crewman Wilson over, and has Wilson hand over his phaser. Then he attacks and subdues Wilson. And let's see. So down on the planet, the temperature is continuing to drop. Now, Spock mentions that they beamed some thermal, like heating units, down to the planet for the men to help keep them warm, but the heating units also were duplicated, and now they don't work anymore. Then they're told about the duplicate attacking Wilson and taking his phaser. And at this point, Spock, of course, mentions that the duplicate seems to have your knowledge of the ship, its crew, etc., and asks, if you were going to evade a ship-wide search, where would you go to hide? And the good Kirk mentions, I would go to engineering. So they decide to go down to engineering to look for the other Kirk. And this is the episode where we get our first look at the engineering deck, for the very first time. And of course, it's not really as big as it appears. The forced perspective is used on this portion to make engineering look bigger than it is. And Spock suggests that they get others to help them search, but Kirk says no, because he doesn't want other people to see this duplicate, to see this other sort of ugly, vicious part of him. Then they split up, which seems like a not such a great idea to me, given the situation, because what if the evil Kirk subdues the good Kirk and then switches places with him, or something like that? Anyway, the two Kirks meet, and I really like how they use the screen here. It's a good, cheap way of, sort of selling the two Kirks on a budget, because obviously this is his body double. What's his name? Spassky, I think was the guy's name. Paul Spassky was Kirk's body double. And that's him here, but you can't tell with the screen in the way. It's a good way to sell the two Kirks without special effects. And Shatner plays this whole scene really, really well. I mean, he's good throughout this whole episode. The good Kirk says that they need each other. And of course, the evil Kirk's like, I don't need you. And then Spock delivers a nerve pinch to the evil Kirk, this being, of course, the first appearance of the Vulcan nerve pinch. And again, Shatner does a great job of selling it here. But as he pinches the evil Kirk, The evil Kirk fires his phaser and winds up damaging the transporter circuitry even more. And in sickbay, Spock really kind of gets to the gist of this episode, noting that it seems to be a man's negative qualities, such as his aggression and his anger, that make a man an effective leader. And we get this is just this is one of the best scenes in Star Trek right here. In fact, there's a couple of them in this episode that are some of the best stuff in all of Trek's canon. And we get one of Spock and McCoy's classic arguments about human nature and which side of Kirk is more useful as a starship captain. And then Scotty tells them, oh, hold on, I need to move to, let me bring this up. Here we go. Yeah. So Scotty tells them that the transporter was damaged further when the duplicate shot it, and it's going to take at least a week to repair the transporter circuits. And of course, the men are freezing down on the planet. And McCoy says that the duplicate is dying again because I think his body is just in overdrive. And it's probably just building up his blood pressure to a point where it's going to kill him. That would be my speculation. And so Sulu and the others, they use phasers to start heating the rocks to try and stay warm. And again, here we see like all his vital signs are elevated. Kirk takes the duplicate's hand to try and comfort him and speaks to him, tries to get the duplicate to calm down, telling him, you'll be all right if you use your mind, if you think. And that seems to have a calming effect on the double, and his life signs stabilize. McCoy then argues that the other Kirk isn't really evil, it's just another part of us, another part of our humanity, and that we all have this harsher side to our nature. And he admits that Spock's right. The power of command seems to largely lie with the other Kirk. When Kirk asks, "What about me? What do I have?" McCoy says that the positive Kirk possesses logic and reason, and then argues that that's where a man's courage originates from, noting that the negative Kirk was afraid earlier while the positive Kirk wasn't. Spock then contacts sickbay and says that they may have found a solution to the transporter problem. They then send the alien dog and its duplicate through the transporter, and the two creatures are fused back into one, but the process kills the animal, leaving them with still no solution. And since this is in production order, this was the fourth episode. This is actually the first episode in which McCoy says, "He's dead, Jim." Although the man trap, he says it in the man trap too, and the man trap was the one that was aired first. So in terms of exposure to the public, that was the first episode. But he actually first says it here in this episode. And it's funny because initially McCoy isn't in this scene. And he comes in just as they're about to beam the alien dog through. And it's like they brought him in literally just so he could say that line. Just so he could say, "He's dead, Jim." Then we get another great scene between the three leads as Spock argues that the animal died of shock because it did not understand what was happening to it, but that Kirk's intellect could allow him to survive the process, while McCoy argues that it's too dangerous for Kirk to risk his life on a theory. Then Spock notes that he has two halves, one human and one alien, and that his intellect, his force of will allows them to coexist, and that Kirk can do that as well. And this is a really important scene for Spock because it goes a long way towards defining Spock's character going forward, because it's been suggested before that he is part human, but I don't think it's ever really been said or expressed so distinctly and clearly as it is here, and really set up this whole conflict in him of him having this human emotional side and this Vulcan emotionless side, and the struggle he has to sort of reconcile those two parts of his character. Uh, and of course, Kirk is struggling with the choice, and asks them to make the decision. Spock then asks, "Are you relinquishing command?" And he says, "No, I'm not." Um, let's see. Kirk tells Spock to ready the transporter and prepare to send the two Kirks through the transporter. Meanwhile, on the planet, the temperature continues to plunge. It's at this point, it's like 120 below or something. Kirk frees his duplicate from the hospital bed, and then, of course, the duplicate immediately attacks him, overpowers him, and takes his phaser. Then puts on the green tunic. And this is again, this is a production goof, because he puts on the green tunic, so obviously the implication is that he took the tunic off of the other Kirk and put it on, right? But that poses a problem later in the episode. I'll get to that in a minute. And we get kind of a creepy scene because he sees Rand in the turbo lift, and he tells her about the whole transporter duplication thing. Of course, he's posing as the good Kirk here, and then, very disturbingly, sort of says, "You won't mind if I come to your quarters later to talk about it, do you?" Yeah. Then he goes to the bridge and he orders the ship to leave orbit, abandoning the men on the planet. This, of course, disturbs everybody. Yeah, that's to me, that scene is even kind of creepier than the first scene, because DJ Ronnie G, because it really shows that this evil Kirk has no conscience. He isn't looking back and like, "Oh my God, I can't believe I did that," or "What was I thinking?" He's already ran for another opportunity. He's already looking to go after her again, and it's like there's no conscience, no guilt. It's just really, really kind of disturbing. Uh, anyway, the crew is, of course, startled that he wants to leave. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that in Mirror Mirror, it's more difficult for the evil ones to act good. Yeah, I think it just comes down to a question of self-control, really. It's easier for someone who has self-control or discipline to act undisciplined than it is for someone who is undisciplined or has no self-control to behave as if they do, right? But yeah, that's a good parallel there. But then the other Kirk arrives, and he's also wearing the green tunic. Again, this is another production mistake. It's like, okay, where did the other tunic come from? I mean, I guess he could have gone. He could have stopped at his quarters on the way, and gotten the tunic, I guess. But again, I'm suspecting it was just a mistake. So he and the good Kirk and McCoy arrive on the bridge, and of course, the evil Kirk is immediately like, "He's the imposter," and we get a standoff. And then the two Kirks confront each other. The evil Kirk threatens to kill the good Kirk. "I'll kill you." And the other Kirk points out, and in this scene, you can really see the other Kirk is getting, again, just like really weak. It's like he's almost struggling just to walk around. Again, I would suspect that his vital signs are just dropping, and blood pressure dropping, and all that. And possibly even maybe his reflexes and his muscular, his autonomic processes are beginning to diminish as well. Although you would think if that were the case, McCoy would give him a stimulant or something to keep him going, but oh well. And finally, the evil Kirk sort of has an emotional breakdown and just more or less just sort of gives in. And then they take the evil Kirk to the transporter. And I guess the evil Kirk kind of, although reluctantly, realizes the truth that the two of them have to go back together, even if he maybe doesn't want to. And so then they send them through the transporter. He reappears. And of course, there's a dramatic pause before he steps off of the transporter and says, "Beam those men up now." And Sulu and the other men, they have some frostbite, but are expected to make a full recovery back on the bridge. Rand says, I understand what happened. I know that it really wasn't you. And Kirk's like, okay, thank you, Yeoman. And then we get another sort of odd scene as Spock is kind of like trolling her almost. He's like, so that duplicate was kind of interesting, wasn't he? Which is an odd way to say like violent and grapey, but I don't know. It's like he's almost getting this weird amusement from her discomfort. I don't know. And the episode ends with Kirk back in command and things as they should be. And this was directed by Leo Penn. Leo Penn is Sean Penn's father, by the way, Sean and Christopher Penn's father. And again, written by Richard Matheson. So overall, pretty good episode. Really a classic episode. This is one of the defining episodes of the series, really. It's hard to think of any that kind of embody the episode more than this one does, particularly with its commentary on the human condition and, again, what sort of makes us human, makes us who we are, etc. And I don't know, overall, I would have to give this pretty high grade. Again, it's the only real issues I would have with it are those kind of production slip ups with the costuming, which kind of minor. And I'm not even sure the second one with the tunics is really that important. But of course, the big sort of, I don't know if you call it a screw up, but the big sort of plot hole is why don't they use the shuttlecraft? And for that, I'm going to go back to Mark Cushman's book and talk about this a little bit more. Let's see here. Where was I? Okay, so a few points on the production of this episode. So, to accomplish the illusion of space, Matt Jeffries, who designed the engineering deck, relied on forced perspective. I mentioned that. Leo Penn, who was 44 at the time, was hired to direct. He was an actor turned director and had recently helmed episodes of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, Lost in Space, and I Spy. The series that he did most work for was Dr. Kildare, where he directed 7 episodes, and Ben Casey, where he was responsible for 19 episodes. And those, of course, are both medical dramas. He would later win an Emmy in 1973 for directing the episode Any Port in a Storm for Columbo. And he is the father of future Academy Award winning actor Sean Penn. No name guest stars were added for this episode. Jim Goodwin was back for the second time as Lieutenant Farrell, the ship's navigator. And he would return again for his third and final episode, which was Miri. Ed Madden played crewman Fisher. Let me find. Oh, wait, I got to go back here. Where's yeah, there he is, crewman Fisher. Um, who gets battered by a fall and then by evil Kirk. Madden worked sporadically in the 1960s, showing up on Gunsmoke and The Fugitive, among other series. He was also seen briefly in The Cage as Enterprise geologist. Oh, okay. He was a background player in The Cage. I didn't know that. Garland Thompson, who was 27 at the time, played the transporter crewman. Crewman Wilson, who again would also get assaulted by the duplicate. Primarily a stage actor, he also played a dancer in the film version of South Pacific and worked in television with a couple of stops on Perry Mason and other series. He would return as an Enterprise crewman again in the episode Charlie X. Okay. Okay, so on day 6 of filming this episode, this was on June 21st. This was the planned final day of production for this episode. Of course, it would, like a lot of episodes, it would go over schedule. The company moved into the new engineering set. This was when Leonard Nimoy made a move of his own to rectify what he perceived as a problem in the script. The stage direction said that Spock, quote, lunges out from behind one of the generators and KOs the double. Nimoy recalled, the scene jarred me when I first read it. It seemed more appropriate for the Old West than the 20th century. And of course, in Westerns of the day, a common trope was that, someone would get clubbed over the head with the butt of a pistol, or something like that and get knocked out. And so that seemed to be what this was imitating. Now, near the time of this production, Nimoy told a newspaper writer, although we are essentially a humanistic show, the Enterprise is heavily armed and a lot of guns get shown. My way of avoiding participation in the violence was the Spock pinch. I decided that Vulcans knew so much about the human anatomy that they could knock out an enemy just by pinching a nerve in the neck and shoulders. Nimoy approached Leo Penn with this idea. Shatner had been listening in, so when Penn asked for a demonstration, he quickly volunteered to be the guinea pig. Nimoy recalled, quote, I applied pressure to the juncture of Bill's neck and shoulder, and he most convincingly fell into an unconscious heap on the floor. Thus, the famous neck pinch was born, in part because of Bill Shatner's talent for fainting on cue. The pinch stayed, but had not been cleared by the front office. Producers Roddenberry, Justman, and Black had no idea that Nimoy, Shatner, and Penn had, behind their backs, made a substantial change to the character of Spock and the format of Star Trek. They found out the next day while viewing the dailies. Roddenberry and his creative staff couldn't help but embrace the idea and immediately began looking for ways to use the pinch in future episodes. The gimmick was even given a name, the famous Spock neck pinch. In time, the pinch became so commonplace that it was merely referred to by its initials in scripts. There would often be a passage that read, Spock applies the FSNP. Regardless of the acceptance, Nimoy had broken protocol, and before this episode saw the light of day, Roddenberry would make an attempt to pull in the reins. Let's see. Then there was the filming of the assault scene in Rand's quarters. Uh, let's see. So Grace Lee Whitney commented, it's a violent, scary scene. Bill is a very physical actor and extremely strong. Extremely strong because I had been on diet pills for so long. I was very lightweight, and Bill picked me up like a twig and threw me around the room. We did endless takes on that scene, and some of the retakes were due to the fact that my beehive wig wouldn't stay on through all that tossing and shaking. It took us the better part of the day. She also added, I was black and blue for weeks. Bill held me so tight I had bruise marks with the imprints of his fingers on my arms for days. Um, okay, so on September 14th, as The Enemy Within was being prepared for delivery to NBC, and Roddenberry again began watching the first instance of the famous neck pinch. He wrote Nimoy, explaining that while he appreciated a good idea, obviously none of us want this to become a habit, since it is precisely this type of thing which has destroyed the format and continuity of more than one television series. Yeah, DJ Ronnie G says a lot of women bruise easily like that. Yeah, some do. And what else is there? Remember, a coworker showed me how it took very little to get a bruise. Yeah, there's some ladies can be delicate like that. There's also, actually, I skipped over it. Where is that? Where is it here? When they were filming the scene where she's talking about in sickbay about the evil Kirk assaulting her. Yeah, here it is. So this was on day 4 of filming. This was a rough episode for Grace Lee Whitney. She really got roughed up for this one. Some do. A lot is probably not accurate. Yeah, yeah, that's fair. So day 4 on Friday, filming took place in sick bay in McCoy's office. It was here that William Shatner gave a hand to Grace Lee Whitney, literally. During a sequence in McCoy's office where Yeoman Rand confronts Kirk and tearfully accuses him of attacking her, Whitney was not sure how she was going to generate the needed emotion. She said, quote, "When I had to do that scene where I was crying with tears running down my face, it was 20 minutes to 12 and everybody was on edge thinking, oh God, if this woman can't cut the scene, we're going to be here throughout our entire lunch break." So at my close up, I've got the tears coming down my face, but I'm struggling to bring up the emotion, the confusion and the shock. And Bill comes up from behind the camera and smacks me right across the face to get me into character. Well, what it did was it just shocked me so much that I did the scene in one take. Whitney remembered the director yelled, "Cut, print it." The cast and crew applauded, and Leonard gave me a hug. I looked at Bill, and he smiled at me and said, "Beautiful." Yeah, I don't think that would fly today. I can only imagine if an actor did that to an actress on a set today. That would probably not go over well. Uh, yes, yes, DJ Ronnie G. I'm not sure. I haven't gotten that far yet, so I don't know. I assume this book will address that. But yeah, I remember when Shatner published Star Trek Memories. Back in God, what was that like in the early '90s, I think, or mid '90s? Yeah, I read about that. That while she was working on the show, someone basically she was sexually assaulted by someone on the show or connected with the show. Now, it's been a long time, but as I recall, um, what is it? She did name names. Some speculate it was Gene Roddenberry, but I didn't read the book myself. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the book doesn't mention who it was. I mean, I would like to think that if it had been Roddenberry, someone would have exposed that by now, even like her, for example. I don't know, but yeah, the book didn't say who it was. The impression you got, or that I got from it at least, yeah, is that it was not someone who was in the cast or like someone who was working on the show daily. It was like someone higher up, some suit with the studio or the network or whatever. As far as who it was, like I don't know. Like I say, if it had been Roddenberry, you would think it would have come out at some point, but I don't know. Who knows? And yeah, well, that's, back in the day, that sort of thing was done. People weren't just so fragile emotionally. You would do stuff like that to get into character or to bring up tears or something like that. And I'm not saying that's the way it should be, but I don't know. I think sometimes we're a little too overly sensitive in modern society, but that's just me. But anyway, getting back to Cushman's book. So Roddenberry, in a note to Nimoy, said, "The time and pressure everyone on set is undergoing during actual photography does not permit the kind of in-depth analysis of scenes which is necessary when such changes are to be made." Speaking of the neck pinch here. Most often, as you are well aware, they may seem to improve the specific scene being shot, but create difficulties and surprises in the cutting room later when it's suddenly realized that key information, seemingly unimportant at the time, has been lost. I'm sure you realize that I have little fear about the kind of professional changes which you come up with. But when one person makes a change, others who may be less capable are encouraged to stick their oar in the water too, and you know what generally happens. Roddenberry's battles with Nimoy over control of the character of Spock were just beginning. Okay, so now let's talk about the shuttlecraft. So, of course, a big plot hole in this episode is why don't they just send the shuttlecraft down to get the crewmen? Well, there's a good reason for that. That's because at this point in the filming of the show, there was no shuttlecraft. It hadn't been made yet. The reason the shuttlecraft was not available to retrieve the landing party is that Desilu, that's the studio, decided to defer construction of the prop and its corresponding miniature until it was known that the series would be picked up for the balance of the season. So I guess basically it had been picked up. It had only been picked up maybe with a half season order, not a full season. And until they got the full season order, they didn't want to commit to the expense of building the shuttlecraft. Because, like, we're not going to pay for this shuttlecraft if we're just going to get canceled in 12 episodes or whatever. This was a necessary decision. Even without the shuttlecraft, at a cost of $193,000 and $646, Enemy nudged above its studio mandated production cost. Today, this would be equivalent to about $1.4 million. So that's why I kind of don't hold it against this episode that they didn't use the shuttlecraft, because they didn't have one yet. You know, sometimes you just have to bend to the reality that this is a TV show and there are budget limitations and time limitations, and you know, just kind of cut them a break. Not everything's going to be perfect. That's why I'm generally harsher when it comes to the writing rather than to production stuff. Okay, so Stan Robertson at the network had worried over how the evil Kirk might bother viewers tuning in for the first time and asked Roddenberry to push Enemy back in the production schedule. But because other shows in production had more time consuming optical effects, the furthest it could be pushed would make it the fifth episode aired, as opposed to being the fourth one that was produced. For the night of October 6th, 1966, there was no other episode of Star Trek ready to be broadcast. Yeah, next Tuesday. Yeah, along with the phasers and the tractor beam. I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a shuttlecraft today. So for the night that it aired, Star Trek came in second. In the first half. In the first half hour, it got a 29.8% audience share. That was second behind My Three Sons, which had a 30.3% share. But then in the second half hour, it actually won that time slot with a 36.5% share. No, I'm sorry, that's wrong. I got it wrong. No, it was still it was actually third. It fell to third with a 26.5% share behind the Thursday Night Movie and Bewitched. Despite the problems in getting this episode made, the continuity goose, and the lack of a shuttlecraft, Roddenberry named Enemy Within as one of his 10 favorite episodes. During an appearance on the Mike Douglas Show in 1968, William Shatner said Enemy was his favorite episode so far. Richard Matheson said, quote, "I thought Bill Shatner was brilliant. I loved what he did. He carried the whole thing. I was a little sorry that Roddenberry put so much emphasis on the crew being stuck on the planet. It took so much time away from Bill, but I liked it and I was very satisfied with the production value," unquote. Leo Penn said, "In every human being, there's good and bad. Hopefully the good is reachable. That particular Star Trek was personal. There was a personal tug of war that was and is intriguing stuff. I worked very intimately with them, hopefully in a stimulating way. It was give and take. William Shatner is a very good actor and gave a very good performance. I had a good time on that show. Gene Roddenberry, in a January 12, 1967 letter to Damon Knight, editor of the newsletter for the Science Fiction Writers of America, said that Matheson had been given an offer to take another assignment, but at that time was unavailable. Many who knew Matheson, members of the science fiction writing community, believe the famed writer did not return to Star Trek because he was displeased about being rewritten to such a degree by Roddenberry. Matheson stayed silent on the issue for decades, but in an interview with this author, he said, quote, "I would have liked to have done more. I had some good ideas. I remember one where Kirk wakes up and the whole ship is empty. There were reasons for it all, of course, and a mystery for him to solve. But Bill Shatner suddenly being alone on this big ship was the basic idea, which I thought was intriguing. I sent that and some other ideas in right after writing that first episode. He, that being Roddenberry, just said no. I don't know what his reasons were. Maybe his reasons were he just didn't like me. Roddenberry had his own concept of what the series should be. He would try to influence the writing, but I just kept doing my own thing, and my own thing happened to grate on him the wrong way." Let's see here. Okay, well, while hosting Saturday Night Live on December 20th, 1986, William Shatner made a notorious reference to this episode. In a comedy sketch, Shatner, appearing as himself at a make believe Star Trek convention, is taking one too many questions from fans overly devoted to the series and then goes into a rant telling the Trekkies, "Get a life, will you people? It's just a TV show." Seeing how he has then hurt their feelings, Shatner immediately backpedals and explains that what they just witnessed was a, quote, recreation of the evil Captain Kirk from episode 37. Episode 37. The actors playing the fans then perk up and shower Shatner with applause. Okay. And what does DJ Ronnie G says? I think JMS named Daniel Day Kim's character Matheson in the Babylon 5 spinoff Crusade. Yeah, I think that character was named Matheson. And I guess it could have been a reference to Richard Matheson, couldn't it? Because the character of Alfred Bester was a reference to us to Bester, the science fiction writer. So yeah, maybe he did name that character after Richard Matheson. I had never thought of that, but good pointing that out. Shatner has a good sense of humor. Well, he certainly has a good sense of humor in his commercials and his performances. I've thought about putting some of his old commercials in these streams too, just for a laugh, like some of those Priceline commercials that he did, which are pretty funny. Okay, well, I think that covers this episode pretty good. Yeah, Bester. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so I bet you're right on that. I bet that is a reference to Richard Matheson. So I guess I've been going for over an hour here, so I will go ahead and end the stream here. And before I go, I will say please do like this stream and share it if you would, and sub to my channel. And I will probably be back with another Trek Talk next week. And the next episode, I believe the next episode is The Naked Time. Let me double check here. Next episode. No, actually, the next one would have been The Man Trap. But I did do The Man Trap first because that was the first one that aired. So that would have been episode 5. So the next one I will do will be The Naked Time. Yes. Another classic episode. All right. So thanks for tuning in, folks. DJ Ronnie G, thank you, sir, for sticking around. And I will see you all next week. Have a good evening.